For 35 years, Iran's most powerful weapon was not a missile, not a proxy militia, and not a nuclear program. It was a 21-mile-wide strip of water called the Strait of Hormuz. Past tense. While every analyst has been focused on U.S. naval operations and military strikes, something far more consequential has been happening in plain sight. The global energy system has been quietly building around Iran's choke point. Let that sink in. According to data compiled by the International Energy Agency, S&P Global Platts, and regional energy ministries, as of April 2026, approximately 4.8 million barrels per day of crude oil and refined products now exit the Persian Gulf region through routes that completely bypass the Strait of Hormuz. That represents a 340% increase from 2015 levels. And the infrastructure projects currently under construction or in advanced planning stages will push that number above 8 million barrels per day by 2028, according to pipeline capacity assessments from Wood Mackenzie and the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. To put that in context, Iran's total oil production before the current crisis was approximately 3.1 million barrels per day. The world is building export capacity around Hormuz that exceeds Iran's entire output. Not matching it, exceeding it. But here is what the headlines are not telling you, and it fundamentally changes the strategic equation. This is not a contingency plan. This is a completed infrastructure realignment that has permanently ended Iran's ability to hold global energy markets hostage. Let us walk through exactly what has been built, who built it, why it matters, and what it means for Iran's leverage in every future negotiation for the next generation. Start with the centerpiece because this is the infrastructure project that changed everything and almost no one noticed it happening. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, also called ADCOP or the Habshan Fujairah pipeline, runs 380 kilometers from the Habshan oil fields in Abu Dhabi's interior directly to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. Fujairah sits outside the Strait of Hormuz entirely. According to the UAE's Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure, as reported by Gulf News and The National, the pipeline became operational in 2012, but operated well below capacity for most of its existence. Initial capacity was approximately 1.5 million barrels per day. By 2022, according to Pipeline Technology Journal and Middle East Economic Survey, that capacity had been expanded to 2 million barrels per day through compression upgrades and operational optimization. In 2025, the UAE was exporting approximately 1.7 million barrels per day through Fujairah. But here is the critical piece. On April 18, 2026, just one day after the United States declared the Strait of Hormuz open under security guarantees, ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, announced an emergency expansion program that would push pipeline capacity to 2.5 million barrels per day by July 2026. According to the statement reported by Reuters and Bloomberg, the expansion involves installing additional pumping stations and utilizing previously reserved surge capacity. The timeline is aggressive. The investment, approximately $600 million according to energy analysts quoted by S&P Global, is being fast-tracked under what ADNOC called strategic national priority protocols. Think about what that means structurally. The UAE can now export nearly 80% of its current production, roughly 3.2 million barrels per day, without a single drop touching the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's ability to threaten UAE oil exports has been engineered into irrelevance. But the UAE pipeline is just one piece of a much larger architecture. On the other side of the Arabian Peninsula sits a pipeline that has operated in relative obscurity for years, but has suddenly become strategically indispensable. The East-West Pipeline, also called Petroline, runs 200 kilometers across Saudi Arabia from the Abqaiq processing facilities in the eastern province to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. According to the Saudi Ministry of Energy and data compiled by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, the East-West Pipeline has a current operational capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day, though it has historically operated at roughly 60% utilization. Before the current crisis, Saudi Arabia used the pipeline primarily to supply domestic Red Sea refineries and to provide limited export flexibility. According to shipping data from Kpeler and Vortexa Analytics, in 2024, only about 1.2 million barrels per day actually transited the full length of the pipeline for export through Yanbu. The rest was consumed or refined domestically. But in March 2026, as the Hormuz crisis escalated, that utilization rate changed dramatically. By April 12th, according to satellite imagery of storage terminals analyzed by Orbital Insight and reported by Bloomberg, tank levels at Yanbu had increased by approximately 22%, indicating a significant surge in pipeline throughput. Shipping manifests compiled by Refinitiv show exports from Yanbu jumped to approximately 2.3 million barrels per day by mid-April, nearly double pre-crisis levels. Saudi Arabia, in other words, has been stress testing its Hormuz bypass infrastructure under real-world crisis conditions. And it is working. According to energy analysts at Rystad Energy, quoted by the Wall Street Journal, the East-West pipeline could sustain 3.5 to 4 million barrels per day in export mode if domestic consumption is optimized and refinery configurations are adjusted. That is not a theoretical projection. That is engineered capacity that exists right now. Now add the Omani dimension, because this is the piece that completes the southern bypass architecture. The Oman UAE oil pipeline, a relatively modest 300-kilometer system with a capacity of approximately 1 million barrels per day, connects Omani oil fields to the Fujairah terminal. According to the Oman News Agency and reporting from Trade Arabia, the pipeline became fully operational in 2021 after years of planning and construction. For Oman, a nation producing approximately 950,000 barrels per day, according to OPEC data, this pipeline represents near total independence from Hormuz vulnerability. But the strategic significance extends beyond Oman. Combined with the UAE's ADCOP, the Fujairah terminal complex now handles approximately 2.7 to 3 million barrels per day of crude exports, making it the largest oil export hub in the world that sits outside a traditional choke point. Fujairah is not just a backup, it is becoming a primary artery, and it is completely immune to Iranian interdiction. Then there is the infrastructure that most Western analysis is ignoring entirely, the eastern routes. Iraq, despite its internal challenges, has been systematically building export capacity that bypasses the Persian Gulf altogether. The Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline, running from northern Iraqi oil fields through Turkey to the Mediterranean port of Tehran, has a capacity of approximately 1.6 million barrels per day, according to the International Energy Agency. Operational utilization has been inconsistent due to political disputes between Baghdad and the Kurdistan regional government, but the infrastructure exists. According to reporting from Iraq Oil Report and S&P Global Platts, flows through Kirkuk-Ceyhan reached approximately 450,000 barrels per day in early 2026 before Kurdish export disputes temporarily reduced throughput. But the critical development is this. On April 21st, Reuters reported that the Iraqi federal government and Kurdish authorities had reached a preliminary agreement to restore full pipeline operations in exchange for revenue-sharing arrangements. If implemented, that would add another million-plus barrels per day of export capacity that never touches Hormuz. Now let us talk about what has been built on the demand side, because a bypass only works if buyers can receive the oil. Between 2018 and 2025, according to data from the International Gas Union and the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh collectively added more than 45 million tons per year of liquefied natural gas import capacity through new regasification terminals on their western coasts. These terminals are specifically positioned to receive LNG cargoes from the Middle East that transit around the Arabian Peninsula rather than through the Strait of Hormuz. Similarly, according to shipping data compiled by Vortexa and reported by Lloyd's List, the number of very large crude carriers, or VLCCs, capable of economically transporting oil via longer routes around Africa or through alternative passages increased by 18% between 2020 and 2025. The global tanker fleet, in other words, has been reconfigured to make Hormuz bypass routes economically viable even during non-crisis periods. And then there is the digital infrastructure layer that nobody is discussing. According to analysis from energy trading firms quoted by Bloomberg and Financial Times, the expansion of futures and spot trading platforms based in Asian markets, specifically the Shanghai International Energy Exchange and Dubai Mercantile Exchange, has created pricing mechanisms that are increasingly independent of traditional Gulf routing assumptions. Oil that never passes through Hormuz can now be priced, hedged, and traded with the same liquidity as traditional Gulf crude. The financial infrastructure now supports the physical infrastructure. The system is complete. However, and this is where responsible analysis must introduce complexity, not everyone agrees that this infrastructure has eliminated Iran's leverage. Dr. Bhushan Bari, a senior director at S&P Global and longtime Gulf energy analyst, noted in an April 23rd assessment that bypass infrastructure is not the same as complete independence. He pointed out that even with all these pipelines operating at maximum capacity, they can only handle approximately 40% to 45% of total Persian Gulf oil exports under pre-crisis flow levels. The other 55% to 60% still depends on Hormuz being open. Iran cannot hold the entire global energy system hostage anymore, according to this argument, but it can still inflict significant disruption. Furthermore, Bari noted pipeline infrastructure is itself vulnerable. A drone strike on a pumping station, a cyber attack on pipeline SCADA systems, or sabotage by proxy forces can disable a pipeline just as effectively as closing a waterway. The difference is that pipelines, unlike waterways, can be precisely targeted. Similarly, energy security analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies have argued that the focus on physical infrastructure overlooks the insurance and operational risk dimensions. Even if oil can physically bypass Hormuz, if the regional security environment is unstable, insurance premiums spike, charter rates increase, and the economic cost of moving oil rises substantially. Iran may not be able to stop the flow, but it can still make it expensive and unpredictable. Those counterarguments are substantive. The infrastructure exists, but it operates within a security environment that Iran can still influence. So the question is not whether Iran has been completely neutralized. The question is whether its leverage has been reduced from strategic to tactical, from existential to manageable, and the evidence strongly suggests it has. But here is the hidden story, the piece that elevates this from an infrastructure discussion to a geopolitical realignment. The construction of Hormuz bypass infrastructure has not just been a technical project. It has been a coordinated strategic decision by Gulf Arab states to permanently reduce their dependence on a security architecture that required accommodating Iranian interests. Look at the timeline of major pipeline investments. The UAE's ADCOP was initiated in 2008, shortly after Iran threatened to close Hormuz during tensions over its nuclear program. The expansion of Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline capacity occurred in phases between 2010 and 2018, each phase coinciding with periods of elevated Gulf tensions. The Oman-UAE pipeline was planned in 2016 and completed in 2021, a timeline that overlaps precisely with the period of maximum pressure during the first Trump administration. This was not reactive infrastructure built in response to a single crisis. This was a two-decade strategic project to structurally eliminate Iranian leverage, and it worked. According to analysis from the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the completion of bypass infrastructure has created what scholars are calling strategic autonomy for Gulf Arab states. They no longer need to calibrate their policies, their alliances, or their economic decisions around the assumption that Iran could choke their economies at will. That psychological and strategic shift is already manifesting in policy. On April 28th, the UAE exited OPEC, a decision that would have been unthinkable if the UAE still depended entirely on Hormuz routes that Iran could threaten. On April 30th, according to reporting from the Times of Israel and Axios, Saudi Arabia reportedly resumed back-channel discussions with Israel about normalization, talks that had been frozen partly due to fear of Iranian retaliation. The infrastructure created the freedom. The freedom is now creating new geopolitical alignments, and Iran is on the outside of all of them. Now let us talk about what this means beyond the Gulf itself. Because when you fundamentally alter the infrastructure through which 30% of the world's oil flows, the effects do not stay regional. In the immediate term, the existence of proven bypass capacity has stabilized oil markets faster than military operations alone could have achieved. According to data from the International Energy Agency and Bloomberg Energy, Brent crude prices peaked at $132 per barrel on March 15th, during the height of Hormuz closure fears. By April 29th, prices had declined to approximately $101 per barrel. Part of that decline reflects U.S. military operations reopening the strait. but a significant component, according to oil market analysts at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, quoted by CNBC, reflects market confidence that even if Hormuz experiences future disruptions, alternative routes can handle a substantial portion of Gulf exports. The infrastructure has removed the catastrophic tail risk from oil pricing models. For consumers, that means gasoline prices, which spiked above $4.10 per gallon in the United States in early April, have begun declining toward 3.75 to 3.85 as of late April, according to AAA. Diesel prices, critical for freight transportation, have similarly eased from peaks above $4.80 per gallon to approximately $4.35. These are still elevated compared to pre-crisis levels, but the trajectory matters. Markets are pricing in a future where Gulf oil supply is more resilient to regional disruptions than at any point in modern history. But there is a longer-term implication that almost no analysis is addressing. For 50 years, global energy security policy was built around managing choke point vulnerability. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, these narrow passages shaped military deployments, diplomatic relationships, and infrastructure investments worldwide. If Hormuz has been effectively bypassed through infrastructure, that calls into question the entire strategic framework. Does the United States need to maintain the same level of naval presence in the Gulf if Gulf exports can largely bypass the strait? Does Europe's energy strategy need to prioritize pipeline routes from Russia or Central Asia if Middle Eastern oil can reliably reach markets through multiple redundant paths? Does China's Belt and Road infrastructure, particularly the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor designed to bypass the Malacca Strait, retain the same strategic value if choke point vulnerability has been overstated? These are questions that will reshape hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure spending and decades of security policy over the next 10 years. However, here's the crucial caveat. Infrastructure creates options, but it does not guarantee stability. The Middle East has never suffered from a shortage of ways for conflicts to erupt, regardless of oil infrastructure. Analysts like Dr. Gregory Gauss at Texas A&M University and Dr. Christian Ulrichsen at Rice University's Baker Institute have noted that reduced energy leverage might actually make Iran more willing to pursue destabilizing actions elsewhere, not less. If Tehran concludes it has nothing left to lose economically, the incentive structure that previously encouraged restraint disappears. The bypass infrastructure might reduce global economic vulnerability to Iranian disruption, but it does not necessarily reduce regional conflict risk. In fact, by removing one of Iran's few remaining tools of leverage, it might increase the likelihood that Tehran pursues asymmetric escalation through cyber warfare, proxy conflicts, or accelerated nuclear development. So here is what we do not know. We do not know whether the bypass infrastructure can actually sustain the throughput levels being claimed during a prolonged crisis, or whether operational bottlenecks, insurance complications, or maintenance issues would emerge over time. We do not know how Iran will respond strategically to the realization that its primary leverage tool has been engineered into obsolescence. Does Tehran accept reduced regional influence, or does it pursue more destabilizing alternatives? We do not know whether the Gulf Arab states that built this infrastructure will maintain operational cooperation during non-crisis periods, or whether traditional rivalries and disputes will reduce utilization and allow the systems to atrophy. We do not know whether global buyers, particularly in Asia, will pay the premium costs associated with longer shipping routes during periods when Hormuz is actually open, or whether economic pressure will push traffic back through the strait whenever possible. And we do not know what happens to oil prices in a world where the Hormuz risk premium has been structurally reduced. Does that produce lower, more stable prices that benefit consumers, or does it remove discipline from markets in ways that create different volatilities? 3 scenarios sit in front of us. Scenario 1, stable diversification. The bypass infrastructure operates as designed. Gulf exports flow through multiple redundant routes. Iran's leverage continues to decline. The region gradually stabilizes as the primary source of tension, energy choke point control, becomes irrelevant. This is the optimistic engineering outcome. Scenario 2, fragile resilience. The infrastructure works during crises, but operational costs, political disputes, and coordination challenges mean it is underutilized during normal periods. The system provides insurance against catastrophic disruption, but does not fundamentally change day-to-day energy flows or regional power dynamics. Scenario 3, escalation displacement. Iran, recognizing its traditional leverage is gone, shifts to more dangerous tools. Cyber attacks on pipeline infrastructure, accelerated nuclear development, intensified proxy warfare. The bypass infrastructure solves the energy problem but creates new security problems that are harder to manage. None of these scenarios returns the world to a situation where Iran can credibly threaten to close Hormuz and hold global energy markets hostage. That world ended not with a military operation, but with 2 decades of deliberate infrastructure investment that reached completion in 2026. The pipelines, the terminals, the tanker fleets, the trading platforms, they were all built in plain sight while everyone was watching missile tests and nuclear negotiations. And now they have permanently altered the strategic geometry of the Gulf. Iran just lost its most powerful card, not to a blockade that could be lifted or a strike that could be repaired, but to concrete, steel, and fiber optic cable that reroutes the global economy around its geography. The next phase of Middle Eastern geopolitics will be written in a world where Iran must find new sources of leverage or accept a dramatically diminished role. And the infrastructure that created that reality is already operational, already pumping millions of barrels per day, and already expanding. If this analysis gave you a clearer understanding of how the world just engineered its way around Iran's most powerful weapon and why that changes everything about Gulf security for the next generation, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the second-order effects of this infrastructure revolution are just beginning to reshape regional power balances, and the consequences will unfold over years, not weeks.